Hello, everybody, to our Tricky Thursday live. I'm Charlotta, and I'm with Tricia today from Creative Costume Academy. And we'll be talking about how to measure yourself for perfect fitting clothes, measuring mistakes, measuring tricks, anything measuring. Very exciting topic.
Yes.
You excited? And how are you,
Yes.
Tricia?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. It's been a little bit of a running around day, but I'm excited to share about this. I think it's a really important topic that a lot of people struggle with. So I'm excited
I
to dive
totally
into
agree.
it.
Yeah.
I'm just remembering I don't have my measuring tape.
I've got
Right?
to remember it.
You've got one.
Um,
Okay.
So yes, we already got a few questions, but if you have any more, please put them in the chat. And I can see there's lots of you around, and I tried to type out a few hellos, but hello Peter as well, and hello Suzanne and Rebecca and Deborah and Stephanie. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And yeah, we'd be happy to answer your questions as they come along. And the questions we already had, we're going to just answer as we're going through the basics, because what Tricia and I thought we would cover is how to, like, sort of the top tips for measuring yourself just for in general, like, good measuring practice, and then
Yeah.
also how you can use measuring for better fit on sewing patterns and for fit in general, things like ease, and I'm sure we have
Hmm.
lots to talk about, but
Yes.
shall we just this general measuring, um
We
do
should
you,
also ask people if you are here and you're enjoying this, please push the like button because it
yes,
helps it like get out to more people. Um, and if you're new, if you're just jumping on for the first time, Charlotta and I do these live chats. We try to do them once a month, and it goes back and forth from my channel to her channel and vice versa. So, so just so you know, heads up, it's usually happening towards the end of the month. But if you like this, follow us for more
yes,
helpful tips.
normally always at this time. And I will put some
Yes,
links in the description below. But you can find Tricia if you search anywhere for Creative Costume Academy.
yes,
That
for
will be
sure.
Tricia.
And Charlotta's Pattern Coloring School is where we find
And
her.
our backgrounds, Tricia, as the name says, is from the costume world, and I'm from fashion. So even with measuring, we might have slightly different perspectives. So that'd be really interesting
Yes.
to compare it. And we got somebody from Las Vegas in typically. So Jess will say,
Ah, cool.
that's Tricia's world, not mine.
That's right. That's where I'm from. Well, I lived there for a long time, so I do have a lot of Vegas peeps. Um, First question that I have for you, Charlotta, is do you measure in inches or centimeters?
Centimeters, of
Of
course.
course.
Actually, yeah, and but it's interesting because I think tailors probably might still measure in inches,
Really?
and because it's, you have a 30-inch waist, isn't it, and a hip, and I think sometimes centimeters are great because they're so precise,
Yeah.
but inches are much easier to remember. But yes, I measure in centimeters. That's just how I work. So, but I have tapes as both, so sometimes quite interesting to compare. Um, and let's actually, Tricia, do you trust your tape measures at all times?
That's a good point. And I have my measuring tapes that I like, but something that you should keep in mind is that they do stretch out, especially fabric ones that we use. They stretch out over time, so you should always be mindful of your measuring tapes. And especially, I don't know about you, Charlotta, but I tend to roll mine, which
Yeah.
is not really good
Good
for your
practice.
measuring tape. So it's good. Something we should point out about that is that we should sorry, I'm getting messages. I'm getting distracted. But when you're measuring, you should use the same measuring device for all of your measurements is going to give you the most accurate because there are those little differences like that. And when you're taking measurements, like the same person should take all the measurements for a certain project. And I say that because my background being in theater is that there's several different people who have their hands in making something a lot of times. And um, whenever I receive measurements from people, I'm always like, who took these measurements? How accurate are they? It should always be the same person. We'll keep things consistent because the same, like two different people can take the same person's measurements, and it will end up to be very different.
Yeah, it's even how you overlap your tape, but it's always worth, if you
Right.
have a ruler, check your tape measurement. Like this, for example, is a few mil out, which you think doesn't really matter, but you know, for height, that actually does make a difference. Or if you're doing tight measurements, too tight on the waist, there's a difference between something you can wear and something which is really uncomfortable. So that's just the most basic thing. Actually, check your tape is correct. And I would also say, to add to that, as Tricia says, it's always to measure twice, to check your measurements.
Yes, check them again. Yeah.
And if you're really finicky, we never used to like the end of a measuring tape. So we always used to start measuring at 10 centimeters.
That's a smart idea.
Starting point. But you have to remember that as you're, you know,
yes, and subtract the 10. But yeah,
because
I have this one, and I was just saying today, and I'm going to take a minute and go and grab my one that I like. But this one I use for like online things because it's only 36 inches, which is not long enough for most people, which is like a yard or a meter in certain in areas. So it's one that I got with a freebie. So I use it for half scale. It works great. But I always like to have, when I'm measuring other people especially, I like to have the long measuring tape is my favorite measuring tape to use, because I want to talk about something, since we're getting into measurements, I mean, and just fitting in general. It can be a very sensitive topic for some people. You know, looking at your numbers, being emotionally attached to your numbers, but ultimately, you know, when you're making clothes that fit you, you need those numbers to be accurate. So definitely don't subtract them because you wish you were less. That's important. When you're measuring someone else, like in a costume shop setting, it's you shouldn't be necessarily like shouting out numbers to your person who's writing them, especially, you know, some people just, you know, it's hard to overlook that number. One thing that Jenny Rushmore of Cashmere shared with us in a workshop she did for my membership is she was saying, you know, if it's hard for you to detach yourself from the numbers, because it is so important for those numbers to be correct, to have well-fitting clothes in the end, is whatever you know, measurement you use. Say I use inches, and so I know what 36 inches is, I know in my mind what 40 inches is, then to use centimeters. So you're like, it's so not, you don't even relate to what that number is, and kind of trick your brain a little bit so that you're like, this is Susie's measurements, you know, and then you're just looking at numbers and you're not emotionally attached to it. So if you're used to centimeters, maybe measuring in inches will be like, wow, look how much smaller all these numbers are, you know. So that's just another thing I wanted to point out, because I know the more that you look at your body, and especially talking about fitting and looking at numbers, you know, and even sizes, which I prefer measurements over sizes any day. Like sizes don't mean anything to me. Like, what are the measurements? But it's so important for those measurements to be correct.
And it's, I think in a way, the more you know your measurements, they become less of a judgmental thing and just something what you are, isn't it? Because you will have perfectly fitting clothes. So it's actually the opposite.
Exactly.
Your clothes will fit you, so you don't always have to say, oh, what size is it? You know.
Yeah, it's you. It's size you, right?
Yes,
when you make it yourself, it's size you.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to share your next point, Charlotta, while I run and get my favorite measuring tape.
So we always measure twice. There is a bit of there's lots of books which tell you where to measure, and I actually have I have drafting courses for both the bodies and the trousers. They go through where to measure.
Measuring tape.
But one thing is always to remember your 3D body, and I've done it wrong. So when you're actually measuring, when you have a measurement on, you need to turn to check it's balanced. So in general, any measurements you take have to be balanced around the body. But Tricia, I was just consulting. I've got a whole book about. It's a 1950s.
What is this book?
Called Sizing, Pattern, Construction, and Grading for Women's and Children's Wear. It's purely a lot. If it goes over, not over my head, but it's just like anatomical terms. But he actually says the natural waist dips in the back quite often.
I think it depends
Yeah, so
because
that's
I've seen it where it raises, where it goes up
yes.
in the back.
But I think the natural waist is the one way, normally the hip and the bust measurements you want to have basically purely horizontal. With the waist, what you would normally do, use an elastic band, or there's different techniques, but if you use an elastic band, it will settle naturally in the waist position, which might be angled. So that's something to consider when you're measuring that your body, because it is about your posture, your curves, it might not all look like it looks in the books when you're measuring. So we're not all
Yes. That's an important tip because absolutely, standard sizing doesn't serve anybody really.
yeah.
Very few, very few. I would say the majority of people just don't fall into
No,
what is
only the
considered
person who's
standard.
measured for the standard size is probably
Yeah,
the standard
right.
size.
So that is a good point because it does take into account, you know, uh, like how, like you said, posture, how you hold your body, the shape of your booty, the shape of your belly, and where those things are. One thing I will say, and that is actually one of our questions, and we might as well, since we're talking about it, the natural waist, like you're saying, the bust and the hip are pretty easy to determine where those are. Whereas the waist, I think I've had a trick and I'll show you. This is the trick that I've always done, the My Little Teapot. Like, I'm a little teapot, short and stout. So wherever you bend in at the side, but some people don't bend in at the side. There's no indention, for a specific shape. So the other thing I heard just recently is, so you can
Underneath
feel
the
your
ribs.
ribs. Yeah, underneath the ribs. Your belly button is not a good place to use because that's different on different people. But underneath, it should be under your ribs and above your hip bones. So we all have those. But also another thing that Kashmirette, Jenny Rushmore mentioned, and I think she talks about it in her book as well, is your waist can be wherever you decide it is. Like if you find that your waist looks better and more proportionate on you to be a little higher, like right under the bust, that could be a more desirable outcome for the silhouette that you're looking for and what you like to see on your body.
That's what I quite like, because my bodice block, for example, only goes to natural waist, but I quite like
Yes.
extending it into a torso block, because that way
Yeah.
you're less thinking, oh, my natural waist is there, therefore my waist on everything is there. But most of the time our waists are slightly lower. So
yeah, especially modern day, nobody wears anything at their natural waist. Like back in the 50s. And if you have like if a nice silhouette on most people, and it gives more shaping, is to have a fitted bodice and then go out at the waist, so that it proportions everything nicely. And sometimes if you bring that lower, it looks awkward sometimes, like it looks too long, and so sometimes that line is better at or above your natural waist, depending on
I
your
think
size.
for dresses, certainly, it's
Mm-hmm.
sort of by
Mm-hmm.
that things will look good for most of us. If you go
But
lower down, yeah, it
but it's
becomes.
because none of us wear our pants at our natural waist anymore. So
Actually, I do.
do you? I do.
I had,
Lately I've been into high waist, which is actually hitting at your natural waist.
yes, yeah. So now I do full natural waist. So, which is, but it is quite weird because it is a bit too high. Sometimes you just think
Yeah,
it
it
wrong.
feels awkward just because of how, I don't know, how we front up in the theater world. Let me tell you, that battle with performers is like, this is a period show. Pull your pants up. I don't care that you wear them. That's not where you wear them in your daily life. That is a constant battle,
I can
that we always
imagine.
have to go up
It's
against.
also, I love critiquing it on films. When they wear things
Yes.
wrong, it's very funny. And we got lots of high waisted trouser fans in the chat as well. They're mostly men, so
it's been my latest thing this year. I don't know. I think I've made like 3 or 4 pairs of pants that are high waisted this year. I don't know.
it's quite
They all go
nice
through phases.
if you sit them on your perfect natural waist or high waist. They don't tend to slide, because what I find
Yes.
trickier is lower fitted ones. When you
Yes.
measure, it sort of moves up too much, while a high waist sort of defines it quite nicely.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed.
And Eliza is asking, does having a tilted waist cause any problems higher in the back, for example? No, it doesn't. You just have to, when you measure it, sort of incorporate it in your block. And you could always draft your block, or when you use a ready-made pattern like Tricia does, you just basically, when you put on your trowel or your muslin, you just basically redraw it so it looks like your natural waist when you're wearing it.
So that's I think the main point with that, like what you were saying about your measurements, your pattern might look very different from what you're seeing in the book or a pattern that you buy at the store, because what fits you and what fits your body might not look. So this is a basic half scale sloper. But if you do have a tilted waist, it's not that it's a problem or that it will cause a problem, but what you're going to see on yours, this is the back. Sorry, this is the front and this is the back. So what you're going to see on yours is it will kind of go up, in the back if you have it higher in the back. Or, conversely, it could go up in the front and come down. So it'll just look different. So that's the important thing to remember is if you take I would trust your measurements. That's why I was saying I don't trust sizes and generalities. Trust your measurements that you're finding on your body, that is what is going to work for your body. And that's a hard thing to get around. You're like, but that doesn't look like what I'm seeing in the book. But that's the thing, is what you're seeing in the book, that person that pattern is for is not the same shape as you, which happens more often that way than that it's going to look exactly like it looks in the book.
And I think that's also one of the things when you measure yourself perfectly and you have actually your correct measurements and you draft the block, it will be individual to you. So it's sort of, it's really hard, because I've done it as well. I think, oh, like a normal pattern doesn't look like that. This has to be wrong. But if it fits, it's right, even if it doesn't look like you think it should look conventionally. So the pattern doesn't lie as much. So don't try to sort of straighten it out if it isn't. Try to follow it too much.
I do want to mention, while we're talking about basics and basically just getting set up with measurements in general, is that a very important thing that you should consider is undergarments. When you are taking measurements for a particular garment, whatever that particular garment is, if it is your basic sloper, you want to have, what do you wear on a normal day? Or what do you wear for whatever that sloper is intended for? Is it meant for your everyday wear? Is it a special occasion? Is it a suit, jacket, sloper, or whatever it is that you're drafting the pattern for? Make sure you have the undergarments that you would normally wear when you're going to wear the finished garment. So if you have your everyday bra, for my ladies, you want to have that on. You don't want to have a sports bra on because you just came from your workout, but you don't normally wear a sports bra when you're wearing the clothes that you're making. But if you're making sportswear, and you want to have a sloper for that or a pattern for that, then you would want to have a sports bra on. So just keeping those things in mind before you even start taking measurements. So let's say if you are making a wedding dress or a special occasion where you want to wear a corset underneath, or a period garment where you're going to have maybe a corseted or a boned bodice, but not a traditional bra on, you would want to make or wear that undergarment first and then take the measurements that you need, because that's going to give you a more accurate read, especially with holding the girls up, holding the bust up, because those can sit in different positions depending on the undergarments that you're wearing, and then that will create different measurements for you. So that's something really important to remember.
Because it's basically all about our curves and how it goes in and out. And if you're wearing different bra, that curve could be different depth, different height. So it is really important to wear the right fitting underclothes. And that also goes back what we said about natural posture. One thing I think we all try to do when you're measuring, you're like, position, is it? Or like a soldier.
And then normally you're like this.
It's really important to actually because if you sort of slightly have forward shoulders, or you are quite relaxed, if you measure yourself standing up really like this, it's not going to fit later on. And you could even, for example, I don't wear heels, but if you always wear heels, I would actually measure myself in the heels, because especially for travel,
shoes in general,
leg muscles, they're not the shoes normally there.
And just your whole stance in
Yeah.
general, like the way that your hips are sitting and all of
Yes.
that, the stance of how you hold your body. So yeah, I wanted to point that out before we got into
Yeah.
more
And it's sort of,
detailed
yeah,
questions.
it's so try to stand natural, and then also so straight, because you always, when you measure yourself, it's very hard. It's to not try to twist too much. So
Yeah.
yeah, 2 or 3 mirrors are ideal for measuring yourself.
Yes. Yes, that's not always the case, but and then
Yeah.
there are some tricks, and that's actually a question that we have. We can get into that. Did you have any more basic
No,
measuring tips? I'm trying to think.
I think that sort of covers it for if you're drafting just blocks, or just want to sort of do the basics. There's lots of sort of opinions on how much you need to measure. Some people say you measure as little as possible and then fix in the trial. Other people like to measure as much as possible. So it's,
That's true. So that kind of leads into, there's a question about that, and that's something that I wanted to talk about too, because this is something, since in my business we're making a lot of costumes, like I'm working with designers who where I don't get to measure the person. So I'm given measurements, or I'm often asked, like, what measurements do I need to create the pattern that I need to make? And so I have my like bare bones basic measurements that I need, or that are going to be most helpful for me. But I've doing it so many years, and working with so many different measurements that are given, and I'm like, that's not right. And you do have to you're going to learn what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Like we're saying, follow the measurements, trust the measurements. That is if you have measured them yourself and double checked them yourself. When you're using somebody else's measurements that they gave you, it's kind of important to use some intuition to where, like, that doesn't make that, like, if this guy's girth measurement is this, and he's a whole foot shorter than this other guy, his being longer than this guy is maybe not so much. So using that discretion. But I would say at the very bare bones, like if I have nothing else, chest, waist, hips, as far as horizontal measurements go, are the very least that I would like. And then like I like as the minimal length measurements is like a neck to waist, front and back, and like an inseam outseam for my lower half. Those are like, for me, the bare bones that will at least give me a general idea. And then if I had been more prepared, I would pull out my full measurement sheets, but where it's like all the measurements would be amazing if I could get all this information on somebody, if I'm making something that is a full outfit or a full garment. But sometimes we don't always have that available to us. So would you agree with those kind of bare
yes,
bones
totally.
measurements?
Tricia, where do you measure your hip?
Well, there's a high hip and a low hip. If it is just the hip, then it's the low hip.
Yeah.
For me, the low hip is, and that's a great question, because that's something I've learned as well,
Yes.
is it's always the fullest part of the booty, right? But if you have a little bit of a tummy that sticks out, or thighs, sometimes your thigh will stick out. So let me show what I'm talking about. So if I was to measure my hips on me, and I don't have very much of a booty, and that's the other thing. This is another thing that I have to bring up to my performers. Do you have a cell phone in your pocket? Do you have keys in your pocket? Take everything out of your pockets when you're measuring your hips, because it does make a difference. And if you are having help or measuring someone else, when you are doing inseam and outseam measurements, make sure they are not looking down, because it's a natural tendency to go, ooh, what are you doing down there? And then you're getting an inaccurate measurement. So have them, I always tell them, look straight, don't look down at me, or else, it's not going to work. So those are a couple of things that I have to mention when doing other people. But when you're measuring, so this is the fullest part of my booty, and you want to make sure that it is level to the ground, with your front, kind of that fullest part of your booty. But on some, you would have, sometimes your belly goes beyond where that level is, or your thighs. You can have thighs that go out beyond that. So in that case, I've had it recommended, like if your belly is sticking out a little bit, that you include that in your hip measurement, especially for pants.
Yeah, I've heard as well that would be your high hip measurement. That's where your belly or your abdomen is widest. That's sort of high hip.
But
And
then
then
it doesn't include the thigh. Well, and then having a thigh measurement is
yes,
also very
yeah.
helpful too.
I think that's what when I first started out, all my skirts used to be really tight because I used to just sort of measure on the bum. But for me, the widest point is actually your thighs, so just at the bottom of them. So it's sort of finding that's the one again. If somebody else measured for you, that could be me. It's like a difference of 5 centimeters. So 2 inches. That's actually the difference between somebody
Quite a bit,
fitting
yeah.
nicely and really tight.
So that was something I haven't actually put it into practice because I don't have many curves. I'm very straight. When I grow, it all grows. I mean, I do gain, especially for pants, I do gain and lose weight in my thighs, usually is where it grows. So I could see that coming to play, but it's usually kind of off to the side. So it's still included. But if yours go forward, and especially like working with lots of dancers or athletic bodies like runners and acrobats, they build up intentionally those thigh muscles. So if you're having pants, it could fit in the way they have very little waist, very little booties, and then their thighs need that extra room. So incorporating some of that into the hip measurement, like accounting for that when you're doing the measurement does help, and then the abdomen as well.
And if you're measuring for yourself, it's basically I always slide my tape up and down until I can slide
it includes it all. That's a good idea.
That's the best way of finding out, because sometimes when you're looking at yourself, because it's 3D again. So I actually have a bum, but overall it's still smaller than my thigh measurement. So it's sort of that sort of knowing it might be oval or round, it's lots of different body shapes, but it's just the widest. It make all the difference between clothes that fit and don't. We've got one question, Tricia. By Tarini. In recent measurements, I have found the shoulder back longer than front to back in bodices. Is this normal or should I make adjustments? So I think she is talking about sewing patterns, I would imagine. So maybe you should move on to that, because we're going to talk about how to make it more, and
comparing.
Yes. So the shoulder back measurement, what would you, is that, Tarini, do you know what you mean?
Yeah. Are you talking about the width of the shoulder, or is she talking about like a high point to the waist, like or the shoulder to the vertical or horizontal? And when you're drafting, a sloper, I'd love to know what your basics are, because in my draft a sloper class that I offer, if you guys are new to me, I'm not a huge fan of starting with drafting your sloper. I give you slopers to start with, and we learn and kind of move back into that. But
I agree.
So in my,
I think you should have done some like playing around with sewing patterns or ready-made pattern before you do your own blocks, because it takes a while and it's really depressing if you're new to sewing and nothing fits and stuff.
So I've tried to do mine so that it's the minimal amount of measurements that you would need, but like so oftentimes you'll hear it like that. This is your high shoulder point. Is that what you call this? Like, the shoulder, neck, shoulder. And then you have your low shoulder point, which is next to your armhole. So that those are common reference points that you'll hear, like when you're being asked for measurements. Because you're taking lengths usually, like that shoulder point to your waist, this shoulder point to your waist, and sometimes you'll go across, get that cross body, and then usually like either shoulder to bust point, usually bust point to bust point. There are some certain ones that you would need.
So my bodice block, I've done it quite basic, so it's sort of quite easy. Trouser block is more in depth, because in trousers in general are different to fit.
There's more to them. They gotta go in between the legs. It's the in between the legs. Skirts are the easiest, let me say. Those are the easiest.
And actually, I've got skirt block as well, because that is really easy. You could just put a tube on yourself, the width of your hip,
and just you're shaping it to yourself.
And we got one other question by Jessie. If I measured my thigh bump, it is a full 1.5 below the waist. Does she mean hip?
Inch and a half. She's saying when she, yeah, I think when she's talking
Yeah.
about measuring her waist, if she's including that that thigh measurement, that it's an inch and a half below
I think that's
the
fine.
hip. Yeah, the hip. Yeah.
Yeah, Jessie, it's very much up to your body. It's again, there's an average measurement between your waist and your hip, but again, that is sort of different for all of us. So if it's basically, if it works for you and if it's your highest part, then
I would say those measurements that we were talking about, where you want to include the thigh, the protruding thigh, and the abdomen, that we're considering, like, if you are going to, since we're going into this part of our conversation, if you're going to look at a size on a pattern, like a commercial pattern, that you would want to include that thigh measurement. You're saying that it comes out a little bit more. So
yeah,
in your
and
hip. So like if your hip itself is say 38 inches, let's say, but going down to your thigh, you're adding another inch and a half into that circumference, and it brings it up to, what did I say, 38, 40, 41.
She corrected herself. She meant 10.5 inches. And that is exactly my measurement from the waist to my thigh bump. So
Yeah,
Jessie, we are
yeah.
similar.
So what I, yeah, and not everybody will have that same depth, you know, like that. Your booty, your hip, your low hip to your waist measurement varies across the board. It could, I would say average, which nobody is. Average, like if you're going to start somewhere, anywhere from 8 to 10 inches is quote unquote average, but you could be definitely more than that or less than that depending on your body. But what I was saying about including that extra abdomen space or including that extra thigh space in your hip measurement, that's for like when you're looking on a pattern, and say your hips by themselves, not including the thigh or the abdomen, is about 38 inches, but then including the thigh, you're adding another 2 inches. So then when you're looking at the size on the chart, then you want to actually look at a 40-inch hip as opposed to going with a 38-inch hip, because that's going to allow for that extra space. And then you can size down, you could take it in a little bit, fit it in a little bit if you want to bring it in, but you're not going to need more space to accommodate for your thigh and your abdomen.
I think if in doubt, you always make the measurement a little bit bigger.
A little bigger.
Smaller. Yeah, if you're sort of in doubt, yes.
Yeah, altering in general, if it's a little too big, is a lot easier to make adjustments than if it's a little too small. So bigger is better.
And if you answer some more questions from the chat, then we also can talk about ease and measuring ease, because there was another question we had before. But Tarini, she had a question about that her shoulder to waist measurement is longer than the front to back measurement in bodices. Is it normal or should I make adjustments?
Yes, that is normal though. Because your center front and center back is lower than your shoulder, generally.
And again, it's, you know, if you talk about sewing patterns, again, they're made for average body, or not even average body, it's for their model who they're cutting for. So you might, if it's different, then amend it. It's always what works for you. It's sort of, I find it really hard to begin to actually trust my measurements rather than what the book said or what the pattern said. But that's, you have to learn that.
And I would say, as far as starting with a pattern that exists already, like take your measurement, like what you were saying, like, do you take a lot of measurements? If you're drafting, the more measurements are going to make it easier for you to make adjustments. Err on the side of being too big than too small is a suggestion that I would give. But when you're comparing your measurements to a commercial pattern or a pattern that you've purchased that you're not drafting from scratch, I would say keep the measurements and adjustments to a minimum and fit. That's my advice. Because you can get hung up on, oh, this point's a 1/4 inch too big, too small, and then you do all these adjustments, and then the balance of the garment is off, or you're not including the design ease that is meant to have in that pattern to sit on the body in a certain way, or you're not sure where that shoulder seam is meant to be sitting. Sometimes it's slightly forward, sometimes it's more farther back. So if you're measuring to the shoulder seam on a pattern and it's not quite lining up with where you're seeing on your body, I typically, when I'm comparing to a pattern, and Charlotta might have a different opinion on this, but when I'm comparing to a pattern, I usually do bust, waist, hips, or chest, waist, hip, and then maybe the center front, center back length. I don't worry too much about my shoulder to waist, my side seam too much. Like that's me. Like you were saying, some people go with minimal measurements and choose to sort it out in the fitting or the toile or the mock-up. That's kind of me. Like I would rather see it on the body instead of spend a lot of time making adjustments and doing math.
Yeah, because I'm just looking at some of my patterns. I'm not sure. I think some contemporary patterns might have how much ease is in patterns. But in general,
well, they have finished garment measurements sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes, but not always. I'm just looking at So because what Tricia said, that if you, for example, looking at a fitted dress, then it should be roughly your measurements because you can fit it. But if you're looking at like an oversized shirt, trying to measure exactly won't work because there's designies in it. So that would be where you might, if you, for example, trying to make a dress and it's sort of semi-fitted skimming, I would actually maybe like use your 3 measurements, as Tricia said, and then maybe even look at a similar dress you already have and see what the design is on that and compare it, because it can be quite abstract when you say like add 2 inches or 5 centimeters of ease around your body. That isn't actually very much.
Yeah, it's not.
Fit.
That's usually for my slopers. That's where I start is 2 inches, and sometimes I take it out, and sometimes I add more.
So I think that's where you have to sort of. In a way, it's easier just to see it on the final, like see the toile, to how it actually looks like this sewing pattern.
Yeah, for me, it makes more sense to see it because I just, I can make myself crazy going that. I do, when I'm making costumes or patterns for people that I am never going to see, like I'm going to ship this finished garment off to them, then I do spend a lot more time looking at the numbers and trying to visualize from my experience what that might look like on the body or where they might make an adjustment. And that's where, we've talked about this in other lives. I leave alteration points that make those alterations easy if there is an alteration to be made. And that's just kind of standard in theater. But if it's for me, or if it's even someone that I'm going to get to fit personally, then I try not to worry too much, and I'd rather sort it out in the fitting, because that really to me makes it a lot easier to sort out in the fitting. But if you're never going to see the person, then you might want to spend some extra time trying to, but still, depending on the design, like you were just saying, Charlotta, it could, you have to kind of use a little bit of intuition as to, and depending on who took the measurements, is kind of like, if it is a little bit bigger in this, like that would be better than not having enough room in this other area, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and Astrid in the chat is saying most of the patterns she's used will have a pattern measurement of a bust, hip, and waist written on the pattern.
Yeah.
Compare that with envelope size. Yeah. I'm never quite sure if it's the size of the garment or the mannequin it's made for. So.
Right.
And you're right. Yeah.
If you're blending sizes too, sometimes that could, if you're blending, which majority of the time people are having to do, you're in between sizes or multiple sizes, which is the great thing about modern patterns, is a lot of times they're layered, so that makes that a much easier thing to do. So that's just a suggestion on that. Was there
because
anything else?
I come from fashion, and in fashion, because we would send it off to Hong Kong to have, like, for example, knitwear drafted or made, but you always measure garments. So when we're saying we want a tight fit top, you don't measure your body, you measure a garment you already have. And the sewing patterns, you can use the same, where you actually say, oh, that coat is perfect. So you use those measurements to compare. For tight fitting clothes, your body is the perfect model, but for looser or oversized clothing is used for garment as well.
That's a good tip for sure, is to measure your own clothing, what you have in your closet.
Less abstract, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we've got one other question about the crotch length.
Mm-hmm.
By Mary Beth. Do you have a favorite way to measure crotch length so that you find a center and accommodate a full tummy and a full bum? So I actually, on my trouser bodice, trouser, oh God, I'm tired. Trouser block coat. I made it.
You did it.
Yes. I measure it completely different. So I don't measure the crotch curve, which I know most people do. I measure the inseam and outseam difference. So it's a different drafting method, but it seems to work
Okay.
for different body types. But how do you measure it, Tricia?
I like to start, my favorite thing, I feel like, is to start with something already. So I'm not always drafting from scratch. So these drafting questions, I'm like, memories, how did I do it? But I usually, because I'm usually asking for measurements, I do measure front to back girth. So that's center front waist through the legs to the center back waist. That would be a half girth measurement. Full girth measurement would be from, this hollow at your neck through the legs to the back neck. Some people, when they're doing the full girth, they'll go to the highest shoulder. So that again depends on how people are measuring. But the half girth is what I would use for pants. Now, determining front to back, that's kind of, yeah, because if you have an abdomen and you have a booty as well, knowing where that is, it's a tricky thing. Like I said, I usually figure that out in a fitting or use something that I know works well for, a body type that I've worked with like that before and sort it out in the fitting. But I'm actively kind of researching and looking at new ways of measuring and kind of determining things for different body types. My new friend, Jennifer Stern. Yeah. Yes, and we had a whole discussion about bendy rulers. She has a great YouTube channel. If you don't know, was it J Stern Designs here on YouTube as well? And she has a Fit Tip Tuesday. Yeah, she has a Fit Tip Tuesday. So she's actually given lots of really great feedback on taking measurements and using a bendy ruler with something that I've heard works well for that as well. And I've also heard so while the if you're doing it on yourself, while the measuring tape is on you, kind of seeing where you would want that inseam to hit, right, where your front crotch would be and where your back crotch would be. Your back crotch is always going to be longer than your front crotch. Your front crotch or your inseam should always sit, it's kind of a rule, slightly more forward, because generally we're needing more of that room in the back. But there are different cases where the tilt of your hip or the shape of your booty will change things just slightly. So that's kind of my knowledge on that. I don't know. And then another thing that I will say I have found helpful in the past as far as measuring is to measure your center front to side seam or center back to side seam at your waist, low hip and high hip as well, as far as like determining the angle of or the width of like those areas. Sometimes I've heard that to be helpful too, like in drafting.
Yeah,
I'm trying to harken back.
But I imagine even for sewing for commercial patterns, in a way, working it out might be even more important. So I don't do. I always feel like I'm opposite. I never do commercial patterns, so I don't know. But do people make like basically their own template of what fits them well to compare to sewing patterns? Because that's what I would do. I would find my crotch.
See, that's where I kind of like, and what I do for myself is I've found and fit a pair of pants on myself where I've sorted that out, my crotch curve that works for me. And then that would be my sloper or my block that I could then use to compare. Because even if it was a different pant style, I could look at the curve and compare that and the length, the length that I need in the front and the length that I need in the back.
Yeah, that's where I would use my blocks as well. And the great thing is when you can, even if it's wrong, you can sort of work out where there might be fitting issues and where you might have to pinch or add extra stuff.
Yes,
Yes, Jen is a great channel to have a look at. She's because she talks a lot about the crotch and how to get it all
Yes,
right.
she's done a lot of
Too
deep
much.
diving, so I've been kind of referencing her,
Yeah.
and just understanding what I'm seeing when I'm doing a fitting. If I'm seeing the wedgie or something happening where you're knowing you're needing to add to the back crotch length, then actually, cutting into the mock-up and adding extra fabric maybe across the booty, or if I feel like more room is needed between the thighs, between the legs, and that's why it's happening, to open up the inseam itself and sew an extra piece or pin an extra piece. Actually, on those pants, I think I have it. That's a common one that I look at, but when you determine how much space you need in that back, then that is usually only added to the back. You're not adding that to the front, because again, your front is generally shorter. Well, generally, in most cases, is going to be a shorter crotch curve than your back crotch curve. I just want to show this because this is one that comes up a lot. So like, she doesn't have legs, so that's part of the reason this isn't sewn together. But I do this alteration a lot on people, where if it just feels like it's really pulling, like you'll get those diagonal lines, and like identifying where I'm feeling I need the space in my curve is I'll open up the inseam, baste an extra piece to the back and then pull it to the front where it meets the front. And then that's going to tell me, how much space do I think I need to add? And that is added to the back crotch curve. So that's, taking that time to find a pair of pants or fit a pair of pants, whether it's a pattern that you buy or a draft or a sloper that you're starting with to begin with, and spending the time to get one pair of pants that fits you really well in the crotch, and then you can use that as a way to check other patterns is what I would suggest. Or if you do have pants that you like the way that they fit in your closet, again, to what Charlotta was referencing with the oversized clothing, that's another good reference, and measuring those clothes because it's not just about the crotch length, it's also about the curve.
Yeah.
And the angle of,
because again, we don't all, like, bottoms come in not many shapes. So you might have a big bottom which is wide or round. So it's like, we might have a flat bottom, which, there's lots of different versions of, which might be the same measurement, but they're completely different body types. So in a way, learning what you need to add there, like Tricia said, which is sort of measurements can only take you that far. And then you might have tinker around on your trial, get it right. But then you actually understand how your curves, 3D curves, translate into a flat pattern. And then you can use it as a template.
Absolutely.
So it's a compromise between trying to measure as much as possible, but also knowing at some point you will just end up with a curve which will fit. And Sign Up is asking, what is considered a proper way to measure the hip? Is it just below the crotch level, at the crotch, or higher on the prominent hip bone? And we actually talked about it at the beginning. So if you rewind about half an hour back, we cover all that. We have a whole discussion about that.
I do want to get to, I don't know, because I can't see the chat. So let me know if there's more questions. But I want to get to a couple questions that we haven't gotten to yet.
And we only got 10 minutes because Tricia has to.
Yeah, you guys, my internet has not been working, and the internet guy is coming. But you know what? He'll probably be late. But anyway, so that's why I want to get to these questions. So Vicky was asking about what is the correct way to measure a high bust. So I do want to go over that, because that was something I mentioned that I learned recently that I found really fascinating at a class that I took at ASG conference this year. But on as far as how that high bust measurement and full bust measurement can help you determine full bust adjustments or small bust adjustments. So I wanted to share about that. And then before I forget, I think the other two that I wanted to kind of talk about too, but I just want to mention them, is ease while you're measuring. Do you need to consider that while you're measuring? And then the other one is, are there some tips on measuring yourself? So let's talk about the high bust first. So when you're doing the high bust, you want this tape like up under those arms as much as possible. And if you can have it be straight, that's good. But really you're going like, it should be kind of going across the front should really be level with as kind of high as you can get up in that arm area. And then that would be your measurement. It will maybe slightly go up in the front, or if you can get it to be straight, you know, all the way around, that would be your high bust measurement. So if you are doing, sorry, go ahead.
We call it a chest measurement.
Chest measurement is another, yes. If you see that, especially I think on vintage patterns, they have a chest measurement. Is that correct?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, UK.
Oh yeah, we're going to commercial patterns. I think there are some, at least the designer that I'm going to talk about, let me remind her, Laura Nash, which I forget the name of her patterns line. She's the one that I took, I can't remember the name of her. So chic patterns. So all of her patterns have a chest and a full bust measurement. And then she talks about how you determine, you know, your cup size. But if you are, so that's your high bust measurement, and then your full bust measurement should try to be as level as possible back to front, and it should be the fullest part. Like if you're looking on the side, the fullest part of your bust. However full that is, and then that would be your measurement. So with those two measurements, Laura lays out in her courses and in her patterns, that's how you can determine what your cup size should be. So if it's a 2-inch difference from your high bust or chest measurement to your full bust measurement, that is a standard B cup. If it's just a 1-inch difference, then that would be an A cup. And, you know, it goes up from there. So 3 inches difference would be a C cup, 4 inches D cup, and so on and so forth. So if you're needing to make, you know, an adjustment, and then you can kind of use those measurements to determine whether you need to add some more. So general patterns are made for a B cup. So if you find that you only have 1-inch difference, then you might want to do a small bust adjustment to alleviate 1 more inch out of the total circumference. So that would be a 1/2 inch on half of the front. That's a back. A 1/2 inch would need to come out. If your measurement is 4 inches difference, then that means you have and she had this great little book that she gave to us, then that would mean you have a D cup. And if the pattern is a standard pattern that is meant for a B cup, then you would want to add in 2 extra inches. So do a full bust adjustment where you're adding 2 extra inches. So this is a very general rule. I'm you know, always of the mind to make a mock-up and make sure to test the fit. But if you're someone who this is an adjustment that you're finding you need to make all the time, that could be a way to figure out how much or how little you need to add or take away from a basic pattern that you might be using, unless your pattern does dictate, you know, what different cup sizes that it has.
I think this is another great example of how, like at the beginning, that measurements are sort of, you know, they have certain value statements, but actually knowing your measurements are really powerful, because you then understand all the relationships of your body. And even if it's just going out shopping, you can start seeing a relationship and why something won't fit. So it's actually a really powerful thing to know how everything relates and why certain things don't fit and how you can change it.
Absolutely. Definitely powerful. And that's why it's important to detach that emotion from what those numbers are, because the best looking clothes, doesn't matter what size they are, as long as they fit. That's the key. And the numbers, nobody's going to come up to you with a measuring tape. And if they do, you can kick them. Tell them I told you you could. No one's coming up to you and measuring you. You're the only one who should know your measurement, or the person who's helping you out with this. So I just wanted to share that about the full bust adjustment and how to make those measurements, because I found that really interesting. I honestly hadn't kind of put that together until I took that. Now going to the...
Sorry, you can always just do it even when you just look at the pattern piece, isn't it, each time, and it saves you one step in the twirling process.
Yes, yeah, it can get you further closer to what you're trying to get ahead of time. Um, and then about having ease while you're measuring. I will tell you, I don't, when you're doing your measurements, you shouldn't be pulling it tight unless you're making a corset or a bustier or something that has no ease, or if you're working on a moulage as opposed to a sloper or a block that has ease included. Because I always add ease to my measurements, but I'm not pulling it tightly. Another thing that we do when we're measuring performers, especially singers, we tell them to take in a deep breath, like, because you're going to expand here in your chest and in your rib cage, so your measurements are going to change. So when we take bicep measurements, we're like flex, make it flex. You want to take that measurement as big as it's going to be, so that you don't make it to your small size and then you can't breathe. We want you to be able to breathe. But I don't necessarily add ease while I'm measuring, other than that.
Yeah, no, it has to be comfortable. So you never pinch, but at the same time, you don't add extra. It's just to be precise. But it's also like, even like for opera singing, but it's to actually measure your waist, not right after you had a meal, but sort of halfway between. Because if
Yeah.
you're at first thing in the morning or something,
Yeah,
it's
you're going to be at your smallest.
Yeah, and then it actually
'Cause
won't be comfortable.
And I'll say another thing that I do is I don't know if you can tell, but I hold my finger kind of behind. So then I am adding like a finger's amount to my measurement, because that allows for, and that's where it goes back to, it's really important. Whoever's taking the measurements takes all the measurements, because we're all going to have our little ways, and then measuring twice just to make sure, especially if you're doing it for yourself. But that's something that I do, is I always kind of keep a finger behind, like between my body and the tape. I have found that to be kind of helpful. Again, too big is easier to deal with than too small. So I'd rather have a little bit of extra, but I don't intentionally add more than that.
And what I do is, I always slide it up and down a bit, just to double check I'm not pinching, because it happens really easily. If you do it sort of skin tight or undergarment tight, it can become easily too tight. So if you slide it up and down, it's actually that's that half finger measurement to make it fit you later on. And then of course you can for basic bodice block, it's about 2 inches to 5 centimeters, and even for a fitted block, like a skin tight block, I still have a centimeter or so you can breathe in and out. Otherwise it gets painful.
Yeah, the thing is, like, measuring the body is so hard because we fluctuate, you guys. Like, don't put a lot of weight in this number. But what I'm saying is, you measure differently in the morning than you do at night. It's just a fact. Gravity, eating, you know. So give yourself grace with that, and do allow for a little bit of flexibility in there. And also, especially with the ladies out there, like, we go through that cycle every month, and our bodies hormones, we change, and some people change more than others during that time. So that's something also to keep in mind when you're taking measurements.
Yeah, but it's actually what I would say is the really important thing when you measure, being aware that each month your body changes, and how you can allow for that seasonally as well, isn't it? When you're making clothes.
Yeah.
And very wide side seam, as Tricia always says, so you can make it.
Yes. Easy alterability, I will always vote for. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention that we did hear about ahead of time was, measuring. Are there any tips to measuring yourself? So there are several tips to measuring yourself. I'd love to hear if you have any, Charlotta, but I will say one thing that I do. So there's a couple things that, and I actually have an old Tricky Thursday. Maybe I need to do another one. But like, say if I'm going to measure my back, I was saying one of my basic measurements that I like to have is my back, neck to waist. So I would usually have a tie or an elastic on where my natural waist is. So I'm always going back to the same point. But I kind of hold it. I can feel with my fingers. I close my eyes and sometimes try to feel, and then I'll hold it. And so, okay, now I'm at the waist, so I can remove that tape, and then where I'm holding it is going to be my measurement. So I don't actually need to see it while it's on my body, and then doing those especially those measurements a couple of times to make sure that you're ending up with the same or averaging, if it's a little bit off. Another one is like doing an inseam on yourself or doing an outseam on yourself is really tricky. So what I do, because again, with that whole, if you're measuring someone else and they're going to look down, then that measurement is not going to be correct. So I'll take a measurement, and you guys can't really see, but I'll step on it, and if you're in bare feet, and then I can kind of pull it up so it's kind of taut to where, I know that this is going to the floor. So if you're making something to the ankle or otherwise, then you want to know that is the difference. But that's another way to get like those measurements by yourself. Do you have any quick tips that you can offer?
Yeah, I would say first thing you mentioned, I try to have tape around like my waist, my bust, my hip first,
Yeah.
and you either elastic or you can even use tape like
like taping it on
tape or
fabric
tape, but just so then you can measure all your vertical measurements more easy. And for the inseam, I sometimes also you can use a ruler, so you can go all the way up, and then you can sort of tape it. You can use your a bit easier that way. But yeah, I think it's just like marking out everything, so you know exactly where to measure. And I think any back measurements are trickier. Like yours is really good for the back one. I also find the back width is quite tricky, because you automatically
that's true.
And you can sort of hold either way and then average it out and then fix it in the trial sometimes as well. Because Erin is saying as well, the hardest measurement for me is across the upper back and the underarm to underarm. Yes, that's exactly the same.
Yeah.
I've seen
it might be some way to measure that, like when you're doing underarm, to do a full circumference, and then you can like mark where your side seam is, and then you can measure your front and then do, subtract that front measurement from your total circumference.
You can sort of measure to back here, isn't it, from the front? It's that point. So yeah, but how do I do it? People have also sort of do like knitting needles in between, but even if you can do is that you hold, so you start at 10 centimeters, so you hold your tape there, you can sort of check it in the mirror, or put a color tape on so you know where to move it in the mirror, and then you can pull it across and again just go underneath
and hold it.
Yeah, it is sort of a thing where you check yourself in the mirror and check you straight. If possible, somebody else can check it for you, but it is really tricky.
I forgot that I also got this they had it's a fancy measuring tape. I think it was Island. Oh gosh, I wish I had the name. She does a drafting system. I think I want to say it's Island Patterns, but there's a little snap on this, so you can kind of make it bigger and then tighten it. So there's a little like a buckle and a snap situation. So kind of rigging, and I know that Gina Renee has some other tips that are not coming to my mind right now. I feel like she has like she attaches something to the edge of her, because a lot of,
is it called Island?
Like putting an eyelet. Yeah, putting an eyelet, if like this one has it, and then you can put like a string or a tape that you can hold onto that could help as you're positioning things.
Actually, if you do your high bust measurement, what you can just do is that you lift up your arm and if you use a tape to go around you, you can actually mark the sort of back of your body, even with a bit of sticky tape or like a sticker.
Yes.
And then you take it off, it will give you the exact measurement at the back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, do that twice and then use the average if it's centimeters or something.
Yeah. So there's lots of tricks, and it is being, aware of how are you standing when you're getting that measurement. Like if you're trying to measure a length of a skirt and you're looking down, you are making your skirt longer, and being aware of that. So I'm trying to think if there's any. Yeah,
the system you were talking about, Tricia, is it called Janet Prey Islander sewing?
Yes. Yeah. So she's the one who had these really cool. So this is a great way. And then that is a way to, she explained how to use it and now I'm forgetting, but I thought it was really cool that you could kind of like put it on and then reposition it while it was on you. And the great thing is it's there's a little red line, to
So you
tell
know
you exactly
exactly.
what that number is. So you can take it off and it's set for you, like where that
Yeah,
position was.
that's really good.
Yeah.
Yes, and if you just finish off, because I know you got your internet guy coming, but we got
Yeah,
one
I
last.
hope he comes soon.
Yes, yes.
It's been not fun trying to work
Yeah.
around not having internet
Well,
with an
thank you so
online
much for
business.
joining us because it wasn't very easy.
Yeah, no, I love it. This was my main thing. I was like, I gotta be here for this live. I want to hang out with everybody. So
Yeah, nitrogen number 10 is saying, I was always told to wear your shoes when you measure your leg length to show for the height in heels. Yes, we talked about at the beginning how you should always sort of wear what you
yeah,
normally wear, and also for muscle position, how your bum will behave differently when you're wearing
yeah,
heels.
your
Your
whole
stomach is
position.
in more, I think, as well. So
And
yeah,
especially if you are fitting a garment, you should definitely wear
yes,
shoes, the shoes that you're going to wear, because there's different heights of the heel and the different way that, like, if you're making a pant or a skirt, how that's going to
yeah,
sit on the shoe. And yeah,
yeah.
it
Because it's
definitely
a
comes into
curved
play.
hem or is it a straight hem? Always so
Hmm.
stupid stuff, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's another one where it's like, did you wear the shoes? Did you bring the shoes?
With
Ah,
boots
you
or
didn't bring your
shoes?
yeah. Yeah, and then exactly, is it going to be a boot with a heel or is it not? So yeah, that is very important. It all comes into play. Well, thank you guys so much for coming with great questions. Really, really good
Yes.
questions. We knew
Yes,
this was
thank
going to
you.
be something that people were going to need to know. That it's how do you know what to look for and what to do? So hopefully this was helpful.
And I think the answer is to know yourself as best as possible to then make everything easier, but not to get hung up on whatever
Yes.
measurement are. But it's just
Yes,
better
I
how.
mean, and that is the real thing. Is it's so easy to fixate on those numbers and to be upset about them or not happy about them, or if they're different from the last time you took them, um, to try and separate yourself from that. And some tips I mentioned at the beginning is to maybe use the opposite. Like if you're used to measuring in inches, try measuring in centimeters. Or if you're used to measuring in centimeters, try measuring in inches. And that is a tip from Jenny Rushmore at Cashmerette. Or, think about it as these numbers belong to someone else completely, was another thing that she mentioned that I thought was a great idea, so that you're not emotionally wrapped up in it. And because really, the more accurate the measurements are to your body, the better fit you're gonna get. And that's the best thing. It doesn't matter what the measurements are, what the numbers are.
Yeah. I mean, yes.
And when you're sharing information about sizing, about pattern drafting, the numbers are always better than saying, well, I usually wear a size 12 or I usually wear a size 2. Um, that, just so everyone knows, in case you're not aware, those sizes change from company to company. So knowing your dress size is really unhelpful
Yeah.
for anyone making pattern. Same with, like, if you're looking at, and you probably realize this if you are using commercial patterns, store sizing is not the same as pattern sizing, and then different pattern companies. So it's always about the measurements more than the number of the size. Like, I just don't even look at that,
No.
honestly.
No, and it's even like a really big company like H&M, the
Mm-hmm.
same
Oh
size in
yeah.
the shop will have a different fit depending which factory made it. So
Yes.
it's like having your measurements actually make buying clothes easier because you can compare it online, which I always quite like. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. If you've joined late, the replay will be on my channel, so you can watch whenever and start again. But thank you so much, Tricia, for joining us. I will put all the links
Yeah.
in so you know where to find Tricia, but even with a quick
Yeah.
search, throw up Creative Costume Academy. And
And
if you
next month,
have plans,
yeah.
sorry, give us a thumbs up, please, because that will
Yes.
really push out the live so people know we're talking about measurements. And next
And
month,
yeah. Yeah, next month we were talking about next month. Next month's like a little crazy. I have a free 5-day fitting boot camp that's coming up the week where we would normally do these lives. So we were trying to find a time that we could still do it. So next month it may be, we're thinking the 17th. Is that what we said? Yeah, the
yeah.
17th, which is a Tuesday. Usually we do these on Thursday, Tricky Thursday, obviously. So do pay attention, that ours will likely be at a different It's usually same bat time, same bat channel. But next month it'll be a little bit different just so you can participate in the boot camp and hopefully join us for that fun. So look out for that. And the best way to know about when we're going to do these lives, we always email our lists. So that is really probably the easiest way to find out how to join us, or on our social media, especially our Instagram and here on YouTube as well.
Well, that's it from us for today. Thank you so much for joining us and learning all about how to measure your perfect clothes.
All right, everyone.
Bye, Tricia.
Bye.